Magnus Carlsen is the greatest chess player of all time, and in today's video, we're looking at 5 of his best games in the King's Gambit opening as white. And yes, these games include some of the strongest grandmasters in the world, including Alireza Firouzja, Ding Liren, Hikaru Nakamura, and more. Okay, our first game is Magnus Carlsen versus Alireza Firouzja from a 2024 Chess.com Blitz match. In the game, Magnus opens 1e4, best by test. And from here, e5 from black, and then the King's Gambit, 2f4 from Magnus Carlsen. Okay, what's the idea behind the King's Gambit? It's very simple. Here, Magnus is just begging black to capture that free pawn on the f4 square with the move e takes f4. Of course, if black does that, then at some point, Magnus will be able to follow up with the move d4, trying to get those beautiful pawns on the d4 and the e4 squares. And if Magnus Carlsen can pull that off, then he may be able to fight for an opening advantage in this game. Alright, in the game, Magnus does go for the King's Gambit opening with 2f4, and here Alireza actually takes the pawn on the f4 square, e takes f4. This is the main move for black here. Now, in this position, white has a wide variety of moves. The two most popular ideas are knight f3 and bishop c4. In the game, Magnus goes for the second option, bishop c4, the bishop's variation. Now, what's the idea behind this move? It's very simple. First of all, this bishop does target that f7 square. That is a very weak square in black's position. And beyond that, white is setting up knight to f3 and short castles on the king side. Now, of course, black does have some ways to block this. For example, the main move here for black is going to be queen to h4 check, hitting the king, forcing king to f1 from white. Overall, white does lose the right to castle. However, he does have the idea knight to f3 coming, trying to knock off that queen off the h4 square, so overall it's not all bad for white. Now, instead of that in the game, Alireza went for a completely different idea, one I haven't really seen in a very long time. That is knight to e7. Now, this is a multi-purpose move. The idea on one hand is to set up a d5 advance, breaking in the center, and on the other hand, black can go knight to g6 next, trying to bolster that pawn on the f4 square. So very interesting setup from Alireza. Now Magnus here, he goes knight to c3, good move. Of course, knight to f3, the alternative is simply no good in this position. Here, black can simply go d5, breaking in the center, and if white takes, black takes back with the knight takes d5, and from here he's up an extra pawn on the f4 square. It's perfectly defended by the knight, and black's going to have a great game. But of course, instead of all this, on move 4, Magnus does not go knight to f3. Instead, knight to c3 is the move. Try to clamp down on the d5 square from black. Of course, black here can still go d5. It is the best move in the position. However, the difference here is after white takes, obviously black cannot recapture on d5. That pawn is defended twice by the bishop and the knight. Instead, here black goes knight to g6. And the idea behind this move is black covers the f4 square with the knight, and his bishop now is ready to go bishop d6 and perhaps short castle next. Now, heading back to move 4, black, instead of going d5, the main idea in this position here is simply goes knight to g6, trying to cover that pawn on the f4 square. However, this move has a lot of problems, and here Magnus has many different ways to put pressure on black. And in the game, he goes for the most creative option. That is simply h4, trying to go h5 next and trying to knock that knight off the very good g6 square. Now, the problem with this move, of course, it does sacrifice a pawn. Here, that pawn is being attacked by the knight and the queen. Black can literally win that pawn whenever he wants to. Now, instead of knight takes h4 immediately, here black goes h5, locking down the pawn. It's going to be very hard for white to defend it. Now d4, and here black's best bet is perhaps simply bishop e7, again, further piling up on that pawn. Instead, d5 on the board. And now, yes, this is a very thematic idea for this variation. However, here, it's just not very good. Here, white simply captures with the knight. Knight takes d5. And obviously, if the knight was still on e7, then black could capture on d5 with his knight. But here, the knight on g6 is unable to go all the way to the d5 square in one go. Now, of course, black still has some great ideas here. In the game, Alireza goes bishop g4, immediately putting pressure on that queen on the d1 square. Excellent idea. Now, of course, white has to do something about it. In the game, he goes knight f3, very good idea. The alternative, say, queen d3, just doesn't look very good here. So overall, knight f3 does look like a good choice from Magnus. However, the problem with this move is black can put more pressure on that knight, and he does with the move knight takes h4. Okay, this is a very interesting idea. First of all, the knight is obviously threatening knight takes f3 or bishop takes, and beyond that, the knight's also threatening the pawn on the g2 square. So here, black has a lot of different threats in the position. Of course, there were some other alternatives on move 8. For example, here, black could go simply knight to c6, followed by queen d7 and long castles. However, this move knight takes h4 is much more interesting for us. And here, what does Magnus Carlsen do? Well, obviously, he has to do something about that threat of the knight on the g2 pawn. Maybe the best way to defend is queen to e2, and from here that queen does do a great job of defending that pawn on the g2 square. For example, black could go knight c6, again intending queen d7 and long castles. However, here Magnus could simply go c3, bolstering the pawn on the d4 square, and if black ever does long castle, then the idea b4 to b5, attacking on the queen side, definitely comes to mind. However, instead of all of this, Magnus Carlsen showing his flair as usual. This is a blitz game. Here he simply takes the knight on the h4 square with the rook. Rook takes h4 on the board, and what is the idea? Well, first of all, Magnus is laying a trap. If black does take the rook with the queens, for example, queen takes h4, this move does put the king in check. However, here Magnus can simply take the queen, knight takes h4, and even if black takes the queen on the d1 square, here Magnus is going to have at least equal material, and all of his minor pieces are just so much better placed than black's. So overall, this would have been a massive win for Magnus if his opponent went queen takes h4, so obviously Alireza Firouzja avoiding that in the game. Now instead in this position, Alireza simply takes the knight on the f3 square, bishop takes f3 is the move. Now Magnus takes back with the queen, and then queen takes h4, picking up the clean rook and putting the king in check. And now Magnus once again has a big problem to solve. Where do you go with the king? Well, it's actually not a very easy problem to solve. For example, if Magnus went queen f2, trying to block the check, then after queen takes king d7, here black is doing excellent. In fact, he may even have a small edge thanks to his one extra rook, Magnus obviously only having one in this position. Now, instead of that, what about the move g3, trying to block? This move looks a little bit crazy. Here's the idea. Black takes the pawn, queen takes g3, then Magnus simply takes back, queen takes f takes, then knight takes c7, forking both the king and the rook on the a8 square. The king has to move, then knight takes a8, and here it looks like Magnus has a big edge. However, after the sequence, knight c6, and then h4, defending the pawn on the g3 square, here Alireza has decent chances in the game thanks to his very far advanced pass pawns on the king side. So far, both g3 and queen to f2 in this position don't seem to work very well. What else can Magnus do? Well, the best move in the game is actually king d1. The idea is the king may actually be safer on the queen side in this game. So for example, knight a6, bishop takes f4, then long castles. Here, white is actually doing relatively okay. Now, unfortunately, instead of king d1 in the game, Magnus chose the other square for the king. That is king to f1. Now, f1 is typically the right square for the king. In the king's gambit, whenever black goes queen to h4 check, and the king has to move. However, here, it wasn't the best idea. Now, Alireza obviously knight c6, setting up long castles on the king side. His king's going to be super safe there. And obviously here, if Magnus goes bishop takes f4, then black simply castles, and black is doing excellent. Now, instead of that, on move 12, Magnus does take that pawn on c7. So knight takes c7 on the board, hitting both the king and the rook on the 8 square. This is where the game gets absolutely crazy. Here, king d7, knight takes a8, and now Alireza Firouzja has to find the most precise response to stay in the game and have fighting chances. Now, the right move here is very, very subtle. Black actually has to give the check on the h1 square, so the move is queen to h1 check, hitting the king. Now here the king has two squares. Obviously king e2 is suicide. Black jumps in with the knight. Knight takes d4, hitting the queen and the king. That would be game over. So instead, king f2 is forced here. Now from here, black once again can go queen to h4. Obviously there is no good way to block the check. If white goes back to the f1 square, then the queen goes back to h1, and we have some sort of draw by repetition. So instead of that, white has to go king g1, and then black can go knight takes d4, and here is the big difference. In this position, with the king on the g1 square, instead of on f1, black is always threatening queen to e1 check. That idea is going to be incredibly dangerous. And if the queen moves too far away, then queen to e1, followed by queen h4 check after king to h2. That could even be a draw by repetition. So, all this to say, queen to h1 by far the best move on move 13, forcing an eventual king to g1 from white. Now, instead of that, Alireza simply takes the pawn on the d4 square right away. Knight takes d4. And as we discussed, the problem with this move is black is never going to have that queen to e1 check resource in this position. Now here, Magnus simply takes the pawn on the f4 square with the queen. Queen takes f4, excellent move. Now queen to h1 check, king to f2. And here, Alireza tries to increase the pressure on the queen with the move bishop d6. However, unfortunately, this does not cut it here. Here, Magnus finds the best move, simply e5, trying to hit the bishop. Obviously, Alireza Firouzja is going to respond with something good. Here he goes rook to e8. The idea is that Magnus does take that bishop, e takes d6. Then Alireza has checkmate in one move, queen to e1 check. Of course, the king cannot go to f3 because the knight cuts that off, and that would be game over instantly. Now, instead of e takes d4, what did Magnus Carlsen play? Well, in the game, he finds a much better idea, simply queen takes d4, picking up the loose knight. And obviously here, the threats include queen takes d6, e takes d6, the bishop cannot move, it is pinned to the king, and for that reason, in this position on move 17, Alireza Firouzja resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Alright, diving into game number 2, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Wang Yu from the 2010 Boss of the Kings tournament. And as usual here, Magnus goes for the King's Gambit with the move 2f4. Now, in the last game, we saw Alireza Firouzja take that pawn on the f4 square with e takes f4, but instead of this game, we're going to look at a different idea from black, that is d5. Now, this line is known as the Albin counter gambit, and black's idea is very simple. He's responding to the flag attack by white with an attack in the center, trying to blow open the center and exploit white's weakened king position along this diagonal. Now, from here, white can obviously capture either the e5 or the d5 pawn. Real fast, f takes e5 is an absolutely terrible move for white. Here, black just jumps in with the queen, queen to h4. And here, white really doesn't have any good moves. For example, king e2 is met with queen takes e4, and the alternative is even worse, g3. That simply loses the rook on the h1 square after queen takes e4. So bottom line, f takes e5, definitely not a good move for white on move 3. Instead, the main move, and the one Magnus Carlsen played in the game, is e takes d5. Now, black has a choice. There is the idea of going e4. That is an official gambit. However, instead, the main move, and the one Wang Yu did in the game, is e takes f4, recapturing the lost pawn. Now here we have a very imbalanced position. Both sides have lost one pawn. Black has that pawn majority on the king side. Meanwhile, white has the pawn majority on the queen side, and that's going to leave for a very imbalanced middle game. Now, of course, Magnus Carlsen's king is still exposed along this diagonal. For that reason, his main priority is getting the knight out to f3, stopping queen to h4 ideas, then going bishop c4, and finally castling on the king side as soon as he can. So let's see it in action. Here, Magnus Carlsen, knight to f3, developing the knight. Black goes knight f6, same thing, targeting the d5 pawn with the knight instead of the queen. Now Magnus, bishop to c4, getting the bishop out, putting pressure on d5 in advance. The knight takes for black, and finally castles kingside for Magnus Carlsen. So completing that plan, getting all of the kingside pieces ready, the knight, the bishop, and finally the king castle. Now black, what's he supposed to do from here? Well, his main problem as well is what to do about the king's position. Here black simply goes bishop to e7. The idea, of course, is short castles on the king side. However, an alternative idea, and maybe a stronger one, would have been bishop to e6. With this move, he is supporting the knight on the d5 square, and he's also setting up knight c6, queen d7, and long castles ideas, and black's king may be safer on the queen side instead of the king side, so that was an interesting idea that black did not go for in the game. Instead, bishop e7 on the board, and now here Magnus, he has to start thinking about what to do about his queen side pieces here. What's the best way to get all of those queen side pieces into the game? Well, he had a few different good ideas. One is simply d4, setting up the idea of bishop takes f4 on the next move. The other was knight to c3, immediately challenging the knight on the d5 square. And for example, if black took back, then simply the move b takes c3 is quite good for white. White can follow up with d3 or even d4 at some point. And while yes, his pawns are doubled on the c file, he is going to have very good pressure on the open b file, pressuring black's weak pawn on the b7 square. So both of those ideas were good options, both d4 and knight to c3 here for white, but instead Magnus goes for a different idea. He starts by taking that knight on the d5 square. Bishop takes d5 is the move. Now queen takes d5 from black, and then knight to c3 from Magnus Carlsen. It's starting to resemble a Scandinavian defense with the knight coming out, hitting the queen on the d5 square. Now from here, black simply retreats the queen all the way to the d8 square. Of course, queen to a5 was possible in the spirit of the Scandinavian,
But here, there is so much action happening on the king side. Trying to keep the queen a little bit closer to the king side, not a bad idea at all. So queen d8 on the board. Now here, Magnus expands in the center with the move d4. Good idea, targeting that weak point on the f4 square. And here, black has an opportunity to go g5 in the spirit of the king's gambit accepted, trying to hang on to that extra pawn. That would have been the best idea. Yes, black's king is going to be stuck in the center. However, he does retain that extra pawn, and that pawn on g5 could be a battering ram later in the game, threatening to move g4, trying to knock that knight off the f3 square. So overall, g5 may be the best idea, but black misses that. Instead, Wang Yu simply goes castles on the king side, and this means Magnus gets the chance to win that pawn on the f4 square. And suddenly, Magnus Carlsen is back in the game. He won back his lost pawn, and his pieces are looking quite good on these squares here. Now black, bishop f5, develops the bishop. Magnus, queen to e2, pressuring the bishop on the e7 square. And now here, Wang Yu simply bishop d6, trying to challenge that bishop on f4 and setting up rook to e8 ideas. From the e8, that rook will put pressure on the queen on e2 on the open e-file. Now Magnus takes on d6, black takes back, and then knight to b5 puts more pressure on the queen, and it also sets up the idea of potentially going c2 to c4. Of course, back here, that knight was blocking the c-pawn, but then after knight to b5, suddenly the c-pawn is free to advance. Of course, there were other ideas. The computer loves the idea of queen to b5, trying to target that weak pawn on the b7 square, but knight b5 also an excellent idea from Magnus. Now black, once again, queen d8, retrieve the queen for the third time in the game back to the d8 square, and then c4 from Magnus Carlsen, a very ambitious move. Obviously, Magnus Carlsen's idea is to try and take control up the queen side in the spirit of a 1d4 or c4 opening. He now has those pawns on the c4 and the d4 squares, and that gives him a tremendous amount of control over all of these squares over here in the center and on the queen side. Of course, the downside of this move c4 is that that pawn on the d4 square is now much more vulnerable. For example, white can never go c3 trying to support it, and this means Magnus Carlsen is committed to playing very aggressively in this game. Now from here, black simply knocks back white's knight on the b5 square. Wang Yu goes a6. Magnus responds knight to c3, bringing the knight back behind those pawns on the c4 and the d4 squares. And now from here, we enter a long maneuvering phase. Wang Yu and Magnus Carlsen slowly get their pieces out towards the middle of the board. Now Wang Yu, bishop g6, getting the bishop off that vulnerable f5 square. Of course, if that knight ever moved, perhaps to knight e5 or knight g5 and so on, that bishop would be targeted. So bishop g6 makes a lot of sense. Now here, black is threatening rook to e8, challenging the queen on the e2 square. With that in mind, Magnus simply drops out of the attack, queen to f2, then rook to e8, all the same from Wang Yu. Now Magnus, h3, taking control of the g4 square and giving the king a little bit of loft if necessary later in the game. And both sides continue developing rook c8, rook to e1. Now finally, black trades rooks on the e1 square. Rook takes, and then Wang Yu plays c6, and finally Magnus makes his claim in the center with the move d5. Again, this is a very committal idea. Magnus here may get that passed d-pawn on the d5 square. Now that d-pawn could be a huge asset in the game or a huge liability, depending on how both sides play. Now, instead of that, there is the Catalan-style idea of the move c5. Now, this move may look a little bit strange. I mean, white is giving himself that backward d-pawn on the d-file, and black now also has access to that d5 square with the knight. For example, knight f6, d5 would plop that knight onto a wonderful square on d5. Now, all those things are true. However, the advantage of this move is it does lock down the queen side. Now, black's pawns on the c6, b7, and a6 squares are permanently weak. Magnus Carlsen would have the idea of expanding on the queen side with a4, b4, maybe even b5 in the future. And overall, Magnus would have a dominant position literally all over the board with the sole exception of that d5 square available for black's knight. So overall, c5 would have been a very interesting idea in the spirit of the closed Catalan. It's a very good idea to keep in mind for your own games. Now instead, d5 on the board. Here black has the option of simply taking on the d5 square right away. Instead, knight to f6 first. These ideas are effectively the same. Black's going to recapture any moment here. And now Magnus, he brings in his queen to the d4 square. A good square for the queen, and of course that square being cleared away for the queen by that d5 advance of the pawn. Of course, there were alternatives. For example, d takes c6 was a possibility here. However, after d takes, rook takes, Black suddenly has good pressure on White's pawns and it's not really clear where White's advantage is coming from. So overall, if Magnus is playing for a win, then the move Queen d4 definitely makes a lot more sense. Now finally, we have some trades on that d5 square. Black takes, White recaptures with the knight, Black takes, and then White finally recaptures with the pawn. C takes d5 is the move. And now, yes, Magnus has that isolated pawn on d5. And here, literally everything in this position is going to revolve around this pawn, and whether or not Magnus Carlsen can push it to d6, d7, and maybe even threaten d8, queening the pawn. Now, Black can successfully blockade that pawn, is going to have a great game, and this pawn may fall later in the game. However, if Magnus Carlsen gets it pushing, he may have a huge attack here. Now, Wang Yu, he immediately blockades that pawn with his queen, queen d6, excellent idea. Now, Magnus, knight to e5, putting pressure on that bishop. Now, Magnus has the option of trading if he wants it. Now here, Wang Yu, he should be sensing danger already. The best move in this position, perhaps, is the Ben Feingold counterattack with the move f6. The idea being, you're just begging White to capture that bishop on the g6 square. For example, knight takes, h takes. And here, it's going to be very, very difficult for White to ever get that d-pawn rolling, and Black should be relatively okay. So f6 would have been a good idea in terms of simplifying the position, getting some minor pieces off the board. Instead, rook to e8 was the move from Wang Yu. And now we have some very dangerous tension on the e-file from both sides. Obviously, that knight is pinned. However, if Magnus can find a way to move the knight, perhaps with tempo, perhaps with check, then the idea of rook takes e8 would be possible. Now Magnus, rook to e3, jumping the rook to the third rank. Excellent move. The rook now defended by the queen. Now all sorts of knight jumps are now possible in this game. Now here Wang Yu, rook d8, getting off that open e-file. Good idea, as White had too many threats there. Now Magnus, knight c4, taking control of that d6 square. And now after the queen moves, Magnus will have the option of going d5. Now, of course, here there is some tension on the queen on d4. Magnus needs those queens alive in order to keep that attack going. Therefore, the move is rook to e5, an excellent idea, blocking the attack on the queen. And now, obviously, Magnus is still ready for that d6 advance in the center. Now, Black h6, giving his king some loft, not a bad idea at all. However, this was a critical moment, and instead of that, the key move was b5, expanding on the queen side, and more importantly, hitting the knight immediately. And here's why. For example, b5, the knight has to go somewhere. Perhaps knight a5 is the best move, eyeing the c6 square, and then Black can go h6, giving his king some lofts. Now, when we go back to the game, you're going to realize why that b5 advance was so critical on that move. For example, here instead, h6 played, then Magnus goes d6. And now here, if Black were to go b5, expanding on the queen side, this would be a fatal mistake. White does not have to go knight to e5, transposing back to that other line I showed you. Instead, here, the critical move is actually d7, and you're threatening rook to e8 check, forcing the rook trade, and then you promote to a queen, and you win the game on the spot, essentially. So, all that being said, b5 here was not the move. Instead, Black had to play it way back on move 28 instead of move 29. Now it is just too late. So with that in mind, what should Black do here? Well, Wang Yu finds the best move in this position. That is simply bishop f5, eyeing the d7 square with the bishop. It's the right idea, but Magnus is not slowing down. Knight b6, excellent knight jump. This does several things. First of all, obviously, b5 is now blocked. That is not a legal move. And beyond that, the knight is eyeing the d7 square, again threatening d7, maybe even threatening knight to c8 in some lines. Now Black, bishop e6, trying to centralize the bishop and blocking White's rook on the e-file. It's a good idea. However, there was an incredible move here for Black. That is the idea of bishop to d3. The tactics here are insane. For example, bishop d3. Now, obviously, the bishop is not hanging. If White takes it, Black simply takes the rook on the e5 square, and from there he's going to win the game. So what's the idea? Well, if Magnus goes d7, then there's the move bishop to b5, eyeing the d7 pawn with the bishop on this diagonal. And once again, Black's tension on that rook on the e5 square prevents White from going a4, trying to knock the bishop off. For example, if White did this, Black can take. Then after knight takes, the move is rook takes. And if the queen takes on d7, then queen takes e5, wins back the piece, and Black here is simply up a pawn. And if anything, Black is going to be the one with winning chances. So going back several moves, that idea of bishop d3 would have been absolutely incredible from Black. Instead, bishop e6, the more human-looking move, very solid idea, But here, Magnus is not slowing down. He wants that King's Gambit victory. D7 on the board. Now Magnus obviously has rook to E8 threats if black ever moves that bishop. Now here, king to H8 from Wang Yu. Wang Yu is basically just waiting now. There really isn't anything he can do productively. All of his pieces are on the best moves. He's almost in some sort of zugzwang position here. Now Magnus A4, spending on the queen side. And here black makes a big mistake, G6. This move looks like it makes sense, but instead it just makes more weaknesses on the king side that Magnus can't attack. Honestly, instead, black maybe had to simply go king G8, just shuffling his king back and forth and not making any more weaknesses. But when that's your best move, you know your position is not very good. So G6 on the board, it's understandable Wang Yu needing to do something, but not the best idea. Now Magnus queen to C3. Excellent idea, threatening queen C8 in certain lines. Now Wang Yu, king G7, getting his king off the back rag, get off any potential shins on the back rag. Not a bad idea. Magnus A5, just expanding. H5 from Wang Yu and H4 from Magnus here. Now, of course, real fast, that pawn is definitely not hanging. If black were to take it, then a rook takes E6 would be the move. This move actually puts the king in check, meaning white would simply pick up a piece for absolutely nothing, as instead of taking back on E6, black would have to move the king on G7 off this diagonal. Now, instead of that, here black actually sacrifices the exchange. He decides the best thing to do here is simply to give up the rook for the pawn and the minor piece. He goes rook takes D7, Magnus takes the rook back, then bishop takes D7. And here, obviously, Magnus has the queen and the rook versus the queen, bishop, and extra pawn of Wang Yu. Now, this is obviously a big advantage for white. Let's see how Magnus tries to press in the game from here. First, queen D4, eyeing the bishop on D7, bishop C6 his move. Very good square for the bishop. Obviously, it's never going to be attacked, and it defends the pawn on B7. And beyond that, it also puts pressure on that pawn on the G2 square. Now here, Magnus, what's the plan? Well, obviously, black really can't threaten anything, and for that reason, Magnus Carlsen is all the time in the world to slowly improve his position. He starts expanding on the queen side, then getting his king to a better square, and then finally rook D5, threatening the queen, and basically forcing a queen trade as the queen is now pinned. Obviously, anything else, queen a6 is not possible as the queen is pinned to the king on G7. Now here, bishop C6 from Wang Yu. The queens come off, queen takes, king takes, and finally rook to C5. Now we simply have an endgame where Magnus has the extra rook versus the bishop and the extra pawn of black. Again, black is just trying to passively defend here. Let's see if Magnus can pull out the win in this position. From here, Magnus Carlsen's first priority is getting his king back to the center of the board. King F2, a big improvement from the H2 square. Of course, for now, it still has to defend G2 before it goes any further towards the center. Now black, bishop D5, the bishop being defended by the king, and G3 from Magnus, the next step in his plan. Now here, Wang Yu, instead of simply waiting passively while Magnus slowly brings his king towards the center, that would be absolute suicide. So with that in mind, he expands on the king side, G5, trying to make some play. Now here, Magnus, he has a variety of good moves. For example, H takes G6 is perfectly playable. Instead of that, here, Magnus finds a brilliant idea. Magnus showing his flair with the move G4. Okay, what's the idea here? Well, this is actually a very common motif in a lot of king and pawn endgames. The idea is very simple. If black takes the pawn on the G4 square, Magnus is going to go H5. Brilliant. Now that pawn on the H file is threatening to go all the way to the HA square. That is going to distract black's king, and that is going to give Magnus other chances in the game. The other idea here, if black takes on H4, obviously, once again, G takes H5 is the move, and again, that pawn once again threatening to promote, and Magnus will have a distraction trying to distract his opponent. Now, in the game, the move from Wang Yu was H takes G4, probably the better idea. At least now black wins a pawn. The other variation, obviously, he wasn't an additional pawn up, so best idea here from black. But then H5, all the same from Magnus. How is Wang Yu going to defend? Well, he starts bishop E4, eyeing that H7 square with the bishop. Rook C7 for Magnus, putting pressure on B7, and also supporting the H7 advance on the king side. Now here, Wang Yu trying to get his F-pawn rolling down the board. F5 is the move, but Magnus is not slowed down with his H-pawn, H6, and then H7, threatening HA, promoting to a queen. What can black do here? Well, he starts G3, hitting the king. Magnus drops back the king, and here Wang Yu's idea is F3. Of course, bishop takes H7 was possible, But then after rook takes h8, white would be in plenty of time to stop those pawns with the king on e1 and the rook on h7. Those pawns really wouldn't be a threat. So with that in mind here, black simply goes f3 right away. And from here, black's idea is something like f2, at which point the pawns will control the dark squares, the bishop controls the light squares, and black may be able to promote a pawn very, very fast. Now here, Magnus h8 queen. He has an extra queen. Black's going to have to do something right now. f2 check, hitting the king. King to e2. Now what? Bishop d3. Very strong idea. Obviously, if white takes the bishop, then f1, promoting to a queen with check, and black once again would have chances. However, instead of that here, Magnus Carlsen simply goes king to e3. Now there is no promotion with check unless black promotes to a knight on the f1 square, but of course, promoting to a knight would obviously not cut it against Magnus Carlsen's rook and queen, and with that in mind here, Wang Yu does not see any possible way to hold a draw. He simply resides on the spot to Magnus Carlsen and his King's Gambit opening. All right, diving into our third game. This one is Magnus Carlsen versus Ding Liren from the Carlsen Invitational Prelims in 2020. And as usual, the King's Gambit on the board for Magnus Carlsen. Now, Ding Liren is a very principled player, and in this game, he goes for one of the absolute strongest lines against the King's Gambit. If you're playing this with white, or if you want a good line with black, this is a great game to study. Here in game number 1, we saw Magnus go bishop c4, the bishop's variation. Here instead, Magnus goes to the absolute main line with white. That is knight to f3. Obviously, the advantage of this move is it does stop queen to h4 ideas from black immediately. This does shore up white's king side. And from here, he has ideas like bishop c4 and short castles. Now, here is black. The main line for black is going to be g5. That is the traditional main line, thought to be the strongest move. Of course, there are other ideas, and in this game, Ding Liren plays a modern idea. This new idea is a favorite of Stockfish and is the Shallop's defense with the move knight to f6. Now, what's the idea behind this move? Well, it's very simple. First of all, black is threatening the pawn on the e4 square. If Magnus Carlsen defends it passively with, say, d3 or knight to c3, then Ding Liren will strike in the center immediately with the move d5. For example, d3, then d5, and here black is doing just fine. In fact, he has a big advantage here. Now, instead of this, of course, the strongest move for white is going to be e5, challenging the knight on the f6 square in the spirit of the Alekhines opening after e4, knight to f6. Now, black, what is he supposed to do? In the Alekhines opening, black goes knight d5. However, here, that would be an absolute disaster. Instead, the best move for black is actually knight to h5, bringing the knight over to the edge of the board, and the idea is now the knight is defending the pawn on the f4 square. That means white is never going to be able to go d4, bishop takes f4, trying to win the pawn back, and black is going to be able to keep his extra pawn for a very long time. All right, what is Magnus going to do about it? Well, he goes queen to e2, decent idea, setting up the queen on this e-file. Now black, bishop e7, d4 for Magnus, and just simply short castles from Ding Liren. He is not afraid to castle his king, and just wait to see what white's going to do. Obviously, he is just hanging on to that pawn for now, and that does give him an edge. Now here Magnus, knight c3, and then bishop d2. The idea is Magnus wants to castle along with the king. That is going to be the safest place for his king. And if he does that, maybe he can even sacrifice another pawn with the move g3, try to open lines against the black king. So not a bad idea overall. Now here Ding Liren plays a very strong idea, bishop g4. What's the idea? Well, white castles, and then the follow-up from black, knight to d7. Excellent move. That knight on d7, of course, is going to be closer to the defense of the king side. For example, instead of knight d7, if black went knight c6, not a bad move, but now the knight is not going to be able to defend the king side if Magnus ever gets an attack going. So this idea, bishop g4, then knight d7, extremely strong from Ding Liren. Now here, Magnus, what's he supposed to do? Well, Ding Liren is playing extremely well. Magnus has to do something immediately to throw his opponent off guard. First of all, e takes d6, not a very good idea. Black simply recaptures with the bishop, and he's got a great game. Again, the pawn on f4 is just completely defended by the bishop and the knight. Instead, one of the better ideas here for Magnus could be knight to e4, trying to centralize the knight. And if he does that, believe it or not, the idea behind this move is to go knight to f2, trying to kick the bishop back, and then you go knight to d3, and from d3, the knight is actually very well placed, putting pressure on that pawn on f4, and perhaps Magnus Carlsen could win back the pawn. Now, instead of this, Magnus plays a very strange-looking move. He actually goes queen to e1 here. The basic idea is the knight on f3 is no longer pinned to the queen. That means perhaps in the future moving the knight is possible. Of course, right now he would lose the rook. But overall, that was the idea. And beyond that, just trying to throw Ding Liren off his game. And it turns out it worked. Here, the best move for black is going to be rook to e8, obviously setting up threats on the open e-file. Instead, Ding goes c6. Now, in principle, this is not a bad move. It does control the d5 square. However, there are certain lines where black actually wants to go c5 in one go, blowing open the center. And now if black ever does that, of course it would be with a wasted tempo. So now Magnus, bishop e2, finally blocking that pin once and for all. Then rook e8 from Ding Liren, good move, again lining up the rook on the open e-file, or the soon-to-be open e-file as these pawns get exchanged. And then here Magnus shows his big idea behind the move queen d1. He actually goes g3. Now this is not a pawn sacrifice as the queen does defend the g3 square. If black takes, then he cannot go knight takes g3 as the queen defends. So Magnus getting some activity on the king side. Now here, Ding Liren's best move, believe it or not, is going to be the idea c5, again, trying to blow open the queen side. Again, the drawback of that move is black did go c6, then c5, wasting a tempo in the process. Instead of that, he simply takes on the e5 square, but this is definitely to Magnus Carlsen's benefit. Here, the best for capture is d takes e5. This would give Magnus a decent edge in the game. Instead, knight takes e5 was played. And unfortunately for Magnus Carlsen, this allows black to make some simplifications in the position. Here, knight takes e5, gets rid of yet another pair of minor pieces. And then here, the key idea from black. Because the knight is no longer on the f3 square, this move f3 is possible. And this is what Ding Liren plays. And this is the start of Magnus Carlsen's troubles in this game. Now, of course, the basic threat is f takes e2. The bishop has to go somewhere in the game. Bishop d3 was played by Magnus. But here, Ding Liren jumps in with the queen to the d4 square. Queen d4 on the board. This is an excellent move, and now the threat is simply f2. And if black gets this in, the pawn is actually no longer undefended. The pawn would be defended by the queen. And of course, that means the queen has to move. And then Ding Liren picks up that rook on the d1 square, only giving up a bishop for it. So that would be absolutely devastating. Instead of allowing that, here Magnus Carlsen jumps in with the queen to the e4 square. Queen to e4. Of course, the queens are now forced to come off the board. Queen takes, bishop takes, but then f2 all the same from Ding Liren. Now, of course, the idea is if the knight takes on f2, then bishop takes e1 wins the rook, and black is going to be up the exchange. That is going to be a massive advantage. So, of course, the rook has to move in the game. Rook d to f1, played by Magnus, the only move. But now Ding Liren is not slowing down. He goes bishop to f3, threatening the rook on the h1 square. And what is the rook going to do? Obviously, rook g1 is not possible as that square is covered by the pawn. Now here, Magnus has some big problems to solve. It turns out the best move is actually knight takes f2. The idea being you're trying to get black to trade on h1. You're giving up the rook, but you do get the bishop and the pawn in exchange for it. It's a decent trade. Magnus would still be in the game. However, instead of bishop takes h1 immediately, black has the idea of bishop to c5, opening up the attack on the knight, threatening the e5 pawn with the rook, and of course the bishop can always take on h1 later. The tactics here are simply insane. It didn't happen in the game, so if you want to find out more about this, you can do your own research after I'm done here. Instead, here Magnus Carlsen on move 19, he went for the move g4, trying to put pressure on that knight on the h5 square. And of course, the idea is the bishop takes on g4, then the rook on h1 gets out scot-free after, say, rook takes f2. So instead of that, here, Ding Liren, bishop to h4 is the move, defending the pawn on the f2 square. And of course, beyond that, the idea is the rook now has access to the e5 pawn, rook takes e5 is coming, and then that knight on the e4 square would be pressured by the bishop and the rook. So again, the tactics here are getting wild. In the game, Magnus takes on h5, g takes h5, that is the best move. Of course, knight takes f2 was possible, but then after bishop takes, and then eventually rook takes e5, black would have an outstanding game. So g takes h5, winning the piece, and here is Ding Liren's idea. Rook takes e5 in response, putting pressure on the knight on the e4 square. Now, of course, the knight is hanging. The rook on h1 is not hanging, but it could be lost due to the bishop. Here, Magnus finds the best idea, knight to g3, defending the knight, also defending the rook on h1 with the knight. And here, Ding Liren could take on h1, but there's no need to as the rook doesn't have any other squares to go to. But now Ding Liren, rook to e8, doubling up the rooks on the e-file. There are going to be a lot of lines where rook to e1 is actually a big threat, and perhaps black can retake with the pawn, creating a queen, creating all sorts of problems for Magnus Carlsen in the game. Now here, what is Magnus supposed to do? Well, the best move is taking the pawn on f2. Here's the sample line. Rook takes f2, Ding takes on h1, the knight takes back, then Ding takes the bishop, the knight takes the bishop, and finally Ding takes the pawn on the h5 square. Here, Ding Liren has the pair of rooks and 2 pawns versus the 3 minor pieces of white. That is an advantage for black. However, due to the material imbalance and those bishops on d2 and d3, Magnus Carlsen would still have a chance in the game, especially considering its blitz. Now, instead of that, bishop c3 was played in the game by Magnus. And unfortunately for him, this game nearly loses on the spot. Here, Ding Liren, bishop to g5, forcing the king back to the b1 square. Now there are all sorts of back rank mating threats. And here, Ding simply takes the rook on the h1 square. Now, no matter what white does, he's going to be in trouble. For example, if rook takes h1, then the threat could be simply rook to e1. That would be essentially game over. And for that reason, here, Magnus Carlsen on move 23, he resigns on the spot to Ding Liren. Now in our 4th game, it is Magnus Carlsen versus Andrew Tang, the bullet chess specialist, and this was a bullet game. In the game, Magnus goes for the king's gambit with the move f4. Andrew Tang takes on f4, and then in this position, we've seen Magnus go knight to f3, we've seen him go bishop c4, but in this game, he mixes things up and goes for a third option, that is knight to c3. Okay, what is the idea behind this move? Well, honestly, your guess is as good as mine. Here, Magnus is just begging for black to go queen to h4, forcing king to e2 from Magnus. That would be an absolute disaster. But instead of that, here Andrew Tang does not go queen to h4. He actually goes knight to e7, a very strange looking move. Now, Andrew Tang's idea, of course, is to go either d5 next or perhaps knight g6, try to further defend the pawn on the f4 square. However, the drawback of this move is it is a little bit slow. Of course, again, queen to h4 was a much better idea. Now Magnus takes control of the center with move d4. Black strikes back, d5 on the board, and now bishop takes f4. White simply wins that extra pawn on the f4 square. Material is now equal, and white does have a much better pawn center in the middle of the board. All right, what is Andrew going to do about it? He takes on e4, begging white to recapture back. However, knight takes e4 immediately is not the best idea, as it gives up control of the d5 square, and if Magnus takes on e4, then knight d5 is possible, hitting the bishop on the f4 square. So with that being said, instead of knight takes e4 immediately, what Magnus should be doing here is actually bishop to c4. Then the bishop and the knight both gang up on that d5 square, stopping knight d5 ideas in the future from black. And from there, white can simply capture the pawn on e4 without any issues. Now, unfortunately, Magnus did not see this in the game. He actually goes knight takes e4 right away, giving black the chance to go knight d5, hitting the bishop, but black does not do that. Instead, knight to g6 is the move, continuing this weird idea of going knight e7, then g6, then maybe bishop e7 and short castles. So now, obviously, that bishop being attacked, Magnus retreats it, bishop g3, good move, keeping the bishop on this very active diagonal here. Black goes bishop e7, and then castles, just as we talked about earlier. Now, from here, Magnus has a very similar idea. He just wants to go bishop c4, and then short castles as well. And he's going to argue that extra pawn on d4, his extra central pawn, is going to give him an edge in this opening. And it definitely looks like he is correct. Bishop c4 on the board. And here Andrew Tang plays another weird series of moves. Knight d7. And then after castles, knight b6. Andrew Tang developing his knights in the spirit of the cow opening as developed by Anna Kramling earlier in 2024. And if you don't know what the cow opening is, after you watch this video, only after, go ahead and YouTube cow opening by Anna Kramling. You'll have a good laugh about that one. Anyway, here, the bishop on c4 is being attacked. Bishop b3 is the move. Again, this diagonal is just superb for that bishop. And now black goes c6. The idea is he was jumping in with the knight to the d5 square next. And if black can pull that off, he might have a decent position here. All right, Magnus, queen d3, developing the queen. The idea is you want to get the queen off the back rank, then go rook a to e1 perhaps in the future. And overall, d3 is not a bad square for the queen. Obviously, it defends the knight on a4, and Magnus may even have ideas of going c3 and then bishop c2, setting up that battery with the queen and the bishop on this diagonal. However, all that being said, d3 may not have been the best square for the queen. The problem with this move is after a future knight d5 from black, black will be threatening knight to f4 with either of these knights, and from there, that knight will put pressure on the queen on the d3 square. So queen d3 may have been a little bit premature. Instead, queen d2 is actually the move. From d2, the queen is not under attack by a future knight to f4 idea from black, and the queen actually further defends the f4 square, immediately stopping knight f4 ideas from black. Overall, queen d2, likely the best move there. Instead, queen d3 on the board, and now black jumps in with the knight to the d5 square, knight d5. Now Magnus rook a to e1, centralizing those rooks. Excellent idea. Those rooks are just monsters on these files right here. And now Andrew Tang has a big decision. Obviously, this was a bullet game. Both sides have roughly 1 or 2 seconds per move to find all of their moves. However, here, the best idea if Andrew Tang had more time was perhaps this idea of a5 expanding on the queen side. Nowadays, Stockfish and all the major computers just love the idea of expanding with their a-pawns and their h-pawns whenever they can. And it definitely works out here. The idea is, of course, you are threatening a4. White's going to have to go a4 back, try to stop the a4 advance from black. But then if white goes a4, that is going to make it much more difficult for him to ever go c4 in the future, try to knock off that knight from the d5 square. As if white does that, for example, a5, a4, then black wastes a move, rook b8. It's going to be very hard for white to go c4 in the future, as that creates too many dark square weaknesses on the queen side. Now, going back, instead of all this, here in this position on move 13, Andrew Tang goes bishop to f5. Interesting move, especially in bullet, putting pressure on that queen on the d3 square. And of course, that knight can no longer move. It is currently pinned to the queen. Now, Magnus, queen d2, getting out of the pin. Again, showing yet another reason why d2 may have been the better square for the queen after all. Of course, bishop f5 can put pressure on this diagonal with the queen on it. However, that being said, the queen isn't currently under any sort of attack on the d3 square. The knight is sufficiently defended. For that reason, queen d2 wasn't really necessary. Perhaps Magnus could have gone, say, c3 intending bishop c2 next, or any other developing move without having to waste tempo just yet. But instead, queen d2 on the board. Now Andrew Tang, rook e8, very logical move. Magnus goes h3, controlling that g4 square and giving the king a little bit more loft if he needs it in the future. And now Andrew Tang plays a very strong idea, queen d7. He's actually threatening bishop takes h3 immediately, and almost regardless of what white does, that's going to be an option. There's only a few lines where it's not really a good move. So for example, if Magnus wastes the move a3, bishop takes h3 works, and Magnus actually cannot take back the bishop. If he takes that bishop with the g-pawn, then queen takes h3 is absolutely devastating. Here black has a huge attack between the queen, the knights jumping into the f4 square, and so on. All right, that being said, what should Magnus Carlsen have played on move 16 in this position here? Well, the move he played in the game is decent, king to h2. Obviously, bishop takes h3, and then queen takes no longer works. Instead of that, the more active idea would have been knight to e5. Of course, now that knight is defended by the pawn on d4 and the bishop. So, for example, knight takes e5 would not have worked. And this move does stop the immediate bishop takes h3, as obviously the knight is putting pressure on the queen right away. So knight to e5 would have been a very good resource. Instead, king h2 on the board. Not a bad move. Definitely defends h3, just a little bit slow. Now here black has a key resource. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the best move for Andrew Tang as black in this position. All right, I hope you found it. The key resource here is actually the shocking move bishop b4. The idea is the bishop opens up an attack on the queen, and the bishop on f5 and the rook are both barreling down on the knight on the e4 square. So now, for example, if white simply goes c3 trying to block, then bishop takes e4, or even rook takes e4 are possibilities, and if Magnus takes back with the c-pawn on b4, then his pawn structure on the queen side is going to be completely shattered. So overall, bishop b4 was a really cool resource that Andrew Tang missed in the game. Now from here, black swings his a rook over to the d file, rook a to e8. And Magnus jumps in with his knight to the c5 square, putting pressure on the queen. An excellent move from Magnus. Now, Andrew Tang, maybe his best move is bishop takes c5 instead of that queen to c8 on the board, getting the queen out of the attack. And here Magnus starts to slowly increase the pressure. Queen to f2, getting the queen over to the king side, setting up potential queen takes f7 ideas. Now here Andrew Tang to respond, bishop f6, blocking the f-file in the future. Good idea. Now knight to e5 from Magnus, both of his knights closing in on the black position. Now black takes on e5, white takes back with the d-pawn, and then bishop e6, Andrew Tang trying to blockade the pawn on e5 with his bishop. Of course, the problem with this move is Magnus has the option of simply going knight takes e6, and beyond that, even moves like knight d4 and tending knight d6 are possible. If white gets that in, that would fork both of the rook and the queen on the c8 square. Of course, instead, Magnus goes for the simpler option, knight takes e6, putting pressure on the rook. Black has to take, but no matter how you take the knight with the f-pawn or with the queen, black's going to be in trouble. So, for example, if black goes f takes e6, the big problem there is black's pawn structure is much weaker, and Magnus Carlsen's bishops on g3 and b3 clearly outmatched black's knights. I mean, not to mention queen to f7 check is coming next. So, instead, queen takes e6 on the board, definitely the better idea, but now black is going to have problems on this diagonal. Look at the bishop lining up with the knight, the queen, and the f7 pawn. Black is going to have a very difficult time defending this. And Magnus finds the best way to exploit this diagonal. Instead of taking the pawn on the a7 square with the queen right away, which was also a good move, by the way, here Magnus simply goes c4, try to knock off the knight, threatening c5 with the discovered attack on the queen in the future. So now, knight b4, c5 immediately here doesn't quite work, so instead, queen takes a7 is the move from Magnus, threatening queen takes b7. All right, what is Andrew Tang supposed to do here? Well, in the game, he goes knight d3, hitting both the pawn on the b2 square and the rook on e1, but it turns out this is a big mistake, mostly due to Magnus Carlsen's follow-up move c5. On this prior move, when the knight was still on b4, it still had access to the d5 square, meaning if Magnus ever went c5, then knight d5 would have been a response. But now, after this mistake, knight to d3, c5 is possible. There is no knight d5 idea from black, and this means black's only chance to stop the double attack on the f7 pawn with the bishop and the rook is going to be rook to d5. But here, instead of taking on d5 immediately with the bishop, Magnus ignores the opportunity. He just goes rook to e3, increasing the pressure on the knight. Of course, Magnus is threatening rook takes d3, as the rook is currently pinned by the bishop to the queen. So Magnus, even in bullet chess, finding really cool ways to just increase the pressure over and over. Now here black goes knight takes c5, trying to win the pawn. And here Magnus has a very powerful resource, simply taking on d5 right away. And after queen takes d5, then rook to c1, increasing pressure on the knight on the c5 square. Now, here's why bishop takes d5 right away was so important for Magnus. In the game, he mixes up the order. Instead, he goes rook to c1 right away, threatening rook takes c5, or perhaps queen takes c5, ideas like that. But the problem here is black has the intermediate move, knight takes b3. Of course, this idea wasn't possible if Magnus took on the d5 square immediately, but now it is for black. Knight takes b3 on the board. And here's the idea. After rook takes b3 from Magnus, the best idea, you don't want to recapture with the a-pawn. Here black simply goes b5, expanding on the queen side, shoring up his b-pawn. Queen takes b7 is no longer a threat, and the queen defends the pawn on the c6 square, meaning rook takes c6. Is not possible yet. And here, Andrew Tang suddenly has the advantage in this game thanks to a superior pawn structure. Wow, how about that? All right, Magnus, he's a fighter. Rook to e3, defending the pawn on the e5 square, stopping any knight takes e5 ideas. Excellent move. Now, Andrew Tang, he spots the resource knight e7, intending knight to f5. That was his move. Real fast, the computer loves the idea of going h5, threatening h4 here. Once again, modern computers and their h-pawn attacks, but anyway, Andrew Tang, knight d7, threatening knight f5. Magnus ignores the threat. It goes queen to c7, increasing the pressure on that pawn on the c6 square. Now, Andrew Tang, knight to f5 on the board, threatening both the rook and putting pressure on the bishop on g3. Excellent move. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he does not need to worry about that knight just yet. Instead, he plays the intermediate idea, rook takes c6, attacking the queen on e6. Now here, of course, knight takes e3 from Andrew Tang is not going to work. Magnus would simply pick up the queen on the e6 square, right? Well, in the game, knight takes e3 was played by Andrew Tang, and here Magnus wins the queen on the e6 square. All right, we've got a queen sacrifice in this King's Gambit. All right, let's slow down real fast. What the heck do we have here? Magnus has the queen, black has the two rooks. Both sides have a minor piece. However, the big differentiating factor here in this position is Magnus Carlsen's extra pawn on the queen side. And this is so important as Magnus can simply go b3 and a4, getting a pass pawn on the queen side, and then threaten to simply push it up all the way down to the a8 square. Of course, Andrew has his own threats. Perhaps he wants to go rook d2 at some point. Putting pressure on that pawn on the g2 square is really anyone's game given that it's bullet. But still, this is going to be a very tense game. All right, Magnus, queen c6, putting pressure on the rook on the e8 square and threatening queen takes b5 in certain lines. Not bad. Black goes king f7 defending. Now Magnus, bishop to h4. Interesting move, stopping future rook d8 ideas from black. Now from here, both sides start shuffling. Andrew Tang putting pressure on the bishop. Magnus giving the check, then going back, bishop to f2. And here, Andrew Tang makes a big mistake. Rook to e7 on the board. What's the problem with this move? It's very simple. Bishop to c5 pins the rook to the king. And that means Magnus is going to win the exchange, giving up just the bishop in exchange for the rook. That is going to be a disaster for black. Black goes king to f7. Magnus takes on e7. And then b3, intending a4 next, just as we talked about, getting the pass pawn on the queen side. And from here, it is just Magnus Carlsen pushing the pawn up the board. It goes to a5. It goes to a6. And in this position, Andrew Tang resigns. There is no way to stop the idea of a7 to a8, simply promoting the pawn on the a8 square. All right, diving into the last game, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru in a chess.com blitz game from 2023. Now, in this game, Magnus starts with the move order knight to c3, Hikaru goes knight c6, and then finally we have f4, the King's Gambit move. Now, you can think of this as a King's Gambit with the moves knight c6 and knight to c3 included, and in just one more move, we're going to transpose back to King's Gambit territory. Here, black goes for the move bishop c5, the King's Gambit declined, white goes knight to f3, and black goes d6. And yes, this right here is an official position you would see in the King's Gambit with the standard move order with the move 2f4. So we are back in normal territory. Here, Magnus simply pins the knight on the c6 square with that Roy Lopez style move, bishop b5. And now black has a big problem. White is actually threatening simply f takes e5 and then knight takes e5. And of course, the knight on c6 is pinned. Therefore, knight to e7 is mandatory from black. So the idea here, of course, that knight on e7 does support the knight on c6. However, technically, white can still capture on e5, then capture again as that knight, even though it is supported by the knight on e7, that knight on the c6 square is being pinned by the bishop on b5. All right, let's see what happens. Magnus takes on e5 with the pawn. So far, so good. And here, Magnus is a very big decision. Is that pawn on the e5 square capturable, or is it poisoned? Well, it turns out it may be poisoned after all. The best move here for white is simply knight to e4, trying to hit the bishop. And then if black goes bishop b6, white simply captures the bishop. Therefore, bishop d6 is a better move. But then once the bishop's off this diagonal, white can finally castle, and white's going to have a great game. However, instead of this knight to e4 idea, here Magnus Carlsen, he actually captures the pawn on the e5 square. Again, the knight on c6 is pinned. Knight takes e5 is not possible. However, here, white's king is super exposed on the e1 square. We can see this diagonal here. Perhaps queen d4 coming, perhaps knight goes somewhere, queen to h4. I mean, there are all these tactics pointing to the white king being in massive trouble. So what is the best move and how does black exploit white's position? Well, the best move here is actually simply short castles. The idea being that knight on c6, after your castle, is no longer being pinned by the bishop on b5. That opens up all sorts of ideas. For example, knight takes e5 is a threat. Knight d4 is a threat, queen d4 is still a threat, and it's going to be super hard for white to solve all of these problems. Instead, queen d4 was played in the game. The obvious threat here is queen to f2 checkmate. Now Magnus knight d3, and the threat of queen to f2 by Hikaru is no longer real. Here, black, his bishop on c5 is being attacked by the knight. Bishop b6 defends the bishop. Then queen to e2 from Magnus. All right, black castles, and now what is white's idea? Well, once again, knight to a4 is the best move here. However, for different reasons than the move prior. Here, knight a4 hits the bishop, but more importantly, it frees up the c3 square for the pawn. However, instead of this, Magnus goes for a completely different idea. That is b3, intending bishop b2, putting pressure on the long diagonal. And if Magnus pulls that off, plus long castles, the queen on the d4 square could be in trouble. However, the problem with this move is after queen d6 from black, now it's not so obvious what white is accomplishing. Here, white captures the knight on the c6 square, bishop takes c6 is the move. But after knight takes c6, here Hikaru is sitting pretty. I mean, yes, he's down one pawn, but the pawn on e4 is relatively weak. White's king is definitely not safe on the e1 square, and black's bishops and its open files on the e and d files are going to leave white under a tremendous amount of pressure here. And in the game, Magnus takes his position from troubling to even worse with the move knight to b5. The idea, of course, putting pressure on the queen and the c7 square in some lines. However, after queen g6, suddenly the queen pressuring the e4 pawn still, and also the pawn on g2, and the queen in general is very active. And beyond all that, bishop g4 is now a threat. For example, if white were to go bishop b2 in long castles, then bishop g4 would skewer the queen and the rook on the d1 square. And that means white's going to have a tremendous amount of trouble castling on the queen side. In the game, it goes bishop b2, black rook to e8, increasing the pressure on the pawn on e4. White has to do something right now, and in the game, he castles queen side. However, this allows bishop g4 immediately, and here again, the queen is being skewered with the rook on the back on the d1 square getting hit as well. Queen f1 on the board, then bishop takes, queen takes, and finally rook takes e4. Now, let's do a head count here. Here in this position, Hikaru is up the exchange. He has the extra rook. In exchange for the extra knight of Magnus Carlsen, he's also up a pawn on f7, and beyond that, his king is arguably a lot safer on the g8 square than white's king on c1. Of course, this is Magnus Carlsen we're talking about, and here he finds an ingenious idea. It's one we've seen before in the earlier games, and as I said, the computer loves to push h4 to h5 to h6 in almost any position as white, and here we see Magnus do just that. h4, gaining space on the king side. The threat, of course, is h5, maybe even h6 if black allows it. All right, rook a to e8. Hikaru playing very centralized chess, good stuff. But then h5 hits the queen. Queen to g4 offers the queen trade, and Magnus ignores the threat. He simply goes h6, the alpha 0 h-pawn slicing up the board. And what is black supposed to do about this? Well, in the game, he takes the queen on d1, queen takes, king takes, and now black has a choice. If he does nothing, obviously h takes g7 or bishop takes will win a free pawn. The question is, do you want to go g takes h6 or g6? Well, in the game, Hikaru goes g6. If you went g takes h6, then rook takes h6 suddenly gives white a tremendous amount of activity on the king side. Therefore, g6 very understandable by black. Of course, this setup here with the pawn on h6 for white and black's pawns on the light squares, that does weaken the dark squares around black's king quite a bit. However, with the queens off the board, it's not going to be that big of an issue for black. Now here Magnus, he starts to fight back. Knight to c3, recentralizing the knight. Rook d4, then rook f1, putting pressure on f7. f5 from black, good idea, giving the king access to the f7 square. If black didn't do that, sooner or later there could be back rank mating threats against the black king, thanks to the alpha 0 pawn on h6, cutting off g7 as a retreat square. Now instead, f5 on the board. Magnus knight to f4. And then knight to d5. Once again, Magnus, despite being down the exchange, he always finds a way to put his pieces on very good positions. Now, Hikaru, bishop d4, the idea, of course, he simply wants to trade bishops off the board. As more and more pieces come off, his material advantage is going to be a bigger and bigger deal in the game. So now bishop takes, knight takes, and then c3 by Magnus. The idea is he wants to go d4 once the knight retreats. And from there, white is going to have very good control over the center of the board. And instead of allowing that, here Hikaru goes for the very interesting idea of c6. The idea being if Magnus takes on d4, black is going to take on d5. And that is what happens. C takes d4 from Magnus, and then c takes d5 from Hikaru. All right, is Magnus going to come back from this material deficit? Is it even possible? Here we go. Rook f3 from Magnus, then king to f7. Knight h3, threatening knight g5 check, Magnus being tricky. King f6 blocks the idea. Then knight to f2, once again reroutes the knight. All right, g5 from black. Knight g4 from Magnus, the idea being that pawn on the f5 square is pinned by the rook to the king. So of course, f takes g4 not possible in the position. King g6 gets out of the pin. Then the knight has to move, but once again, knight to e5, hitting the king. Magnus again finding these good squares for his pieces. Now it may look like the king can simply pick up the pawn on the h6 square. King takes h6. However, if Hikaru did this move loses on the spot to knight to f7. Of course, that move forks both the rook and the king. That would be game over as the rook is undefended on the d6 square. So instead of that, king to f6 on the board by Hikaru. Simply ignore the pawn on h6 for now. Now from here, Magnus retreats again with the knight, knight g4, hitting the king. The idea being if the king goes to g6, Magnus will jump back to the e5 square, offering a repetition of moves. So of course, Hikaru ignores that. Back in this position, instead of king g6, he simply goes king to f7. Again, renewing the pressure on h6 with the rook and getting the king to safety. However, the problem here is that the rook takes f5, black does lose a pawn. Granted, white's extra pawn is the double pawn on the d-file. However, a pawn is a pawn, it still counts. Now, king g6 from Hikaru, rook to f3, the rook was being attacked. Rook d to e6, black doubling up on the e-file. It's getting quite dangerous for Magnus, so he jumps in with the knight to the e5 square, blocking the rooks for now. But now suddenly, black's king can take the pawn on the h6 square, as there is simply no discovered attack on the king and the rook, as the rook is no longer on d6. So king takes h6, black wins back the pawn. He now has these two pawns on the king side. That is going to be tough for Magnus to stop. All right, Magnus, king e2, a little bit dangerous, putting the knight into the pin with the king. What's the idea? Let's see. Rook a d7, Hikaru playing with his food here. He's in no rush. Rook f5, h6, and now the losing move, knight to f3 from Magnus Carlsen. This is just not good enough. Here, Hikaru actually has the resource rook to e2, putting pressure on that g2 pawn, and it's going to be very hard for white to defend. Instead, rook d6, good enough. Magnus goes g4, and then finally the winning move, rook to f6. Here, the rook on f5 is going to be traded. There's no other retreat square for the rook. And then after, say, rook takes, king takes, with that extra rook versus the one knight of Magnus Carlsen, Hikaru is going to have no problem cleaning up in the endgame. And for that reason, in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigns on the spot to Hikaru Nakamura. Wow, what a series of games by Magnus Carlsen in the King's Gambit opening with the key move to f4. This was some very exciting chess. Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed these games as much as I did. And if you enjoyed this content, go ahead and show me some love. Go ahead and like the video, subscribe to my channel, comment down below if there's anything you want to comment with. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, and I will see you in the next video.